So welcome this afternoon to this afternoon session on the third day of the 2020 Progressive Governance Digital Summit. Firstly, a very warm welcome to those of you who are joining us this afternoon. We're here to discuss a big question that many people are grappling with across the progressive spectrum, which is looking at how we can combine economic progress and recovery from this difficult and challenging time of COVID-19 with social equity. Before we kick off and I introduce you to the full range of speakers, I'd first like to pass over to Ralph Hexsell, who is head of the Europe department at Friedrich Albert Stiftung, the oldest political foundation in Germany with a tradition in social democracy, upholding the values of freedom, justice and solidarity. So if I first may pass the floor to Ralph.
Yeah, thank you, Zoe. Good afternoon, everybody, dear speakers and discussants. I'm very pleased to give a short introduction to this very important panel dealing with the post-COVID-19 economic recovery and social equity in Europe. From a social democratic point of view, I think the two tasks, economic recovery and social equity, cannot be separated from each other. They are very closely linked in terms of content and time. The 750 billion recovery program of the European Union is a very historical step, I think, and will certainly have a strong impact on the future of the Union. And now it is a central matter and challenge of shaping and implementing this program in such a way that these two tasks are really met and fulfilled. The recovery plan will only be successful if the 27 member countries will stand together in solidarity. All the countries face a severe economic crisis, but the recovery of the Southern European countries will be key. COVID-19 has highlighted the faults of privatizing public sector institutions. It also highlighted social inequality, the gender gap, among other crucial characteristics of system-relevant jobs. And if there's any positive impact of COVID-19, of the corona crisis, it might be to highlight the indispensable role of the state and of strong public sector institutions, while part of the misery has been caused by neoliberal free market politics. Now there's a chance to correct this path and gain back voters' appreciation and support. At least in Germany, polls show clearly that significant parts of disappointed voters demand a change in social governance. Healthcare, labor policies, as well as equal access to education build the heart of social welfare states. Austerity policies and privatization have caused great damage, and some states have maintained a strong social system, like, for example, Sweden, Portugal, also Germany. Others have chosen a different path by establishing a strong division between public and private systems. The result is segregation by class, race, and gender. And now COVID-19 crisis shows all this in a nutshell. Therefore, I think progressive governance must provide equal chances to everyone. This is not an aid package, but the only way to create sustainable growth as well as social cohesion. The short-term thinking of neoliberal path has come to collapse. We strongly believe, also at Friedrich Ebert Foundation, that more equal societies end up being also more democratic societies. Therefore, social policies also affect the rise or fall of right-wing governments. It is of great importance to exchange ideas on how to gain back social democratic majorities in Europe. I'm therefore very pleased they are not here yet, but that also the Dutch and Belgian leader of social democratic parties are present in this discussion. Also, I would like to give a warm greeting to Enna Gerin, head of the Katalys think tank from Sweden, a close partner of our office in Stockholm, and also to Silja Häusermann, with whom we also closely cooperate. So thank you for your attention. Now I wish you a lively and enlightening debate. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Ralph. And I think you've reminded us quite rightly all that whilst we discuss the package of proposals that we think will take us from this moment to recovery, we always have to bear in mind what we think progressive voters will also want in the face of rising populism. So I think that's perhaps a question we can pick up in the discussion later. But thank you very much again for your introduction. By means of a brief introduction, my name is Zoe Billingham. I'm Head of Policy and Engagement at the Centre for Progressive Policy. We're a think tank based in London, UK, looking at inclusive growth and increasingly inclusive recoveries. I'm here today to moderate the discussion on how we can combine economic recovery and social equity, which, as Ralph said, go hand in hand. And just to build on what Ralph has said, we progressives know that we need to use this moment of transition from a health and economic crisis to rebuild a progressive economy and society. We also need to think beyond our national borders to international cooperation. And we know, and delighted to have such an international panel today, that many leaders across Europe are facing quite the similar problem. Following the global financial crisis, which was already over a decade ago, we saw that returning to the status quo after such a seismic shock to our economy and society is just not an option. So today I'm really delighted that we're going to pick up how we can rebuild and look to the future. In terms of the format for this afternoon's discussion, each speaker will have 5 minutes to present their headline view on how they think we can move forward to a progressive recovery. After they've had the floor, we will be open for questions from those of you watching this afternoon, and we will put those to the speakers and discuss them amongst us. So without further ado, I'm just going to introduce each of the speakers in turn that they'll be speaking this afternoon before handing over to Jakob, our first speaker today. So Jakob von Weizsäcker is our first speaker today, and he will be speaking about the stimulus package that has been heralded by Germany as well as others across Europe. He is currently the Chief Economist and Director General for Economic and Fiscal Policy and Global Economy at the German Federal Ministry of Finance. Previous to that, he was a Member of Parliament for the European Parliament. Secondly, we will hear from Enna Gerin on how we will move from austerity and towards public investment. Enna is Deputy Director at the Union Policy Institute, Katalys in Sweden. Then we will turn to Silja Häusermann on the role of the welfare state and challenges for the working class. Silja is a professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Zurich. And last but not least, we will hear from László Andor, who will take us to the European level and set out what perhaps our newfound fiscal solidarity means for addressing the fallout of COVID-19. László is the General Secretary of the Foundation for European Progressive Studies and a former EU Commissioner for Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion. So we certainly have the right people around the table. So without further ado, Jakob, may I pass the floor to you?
Yes, Zoe, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. And let me start by saying that while, of course, this crisis is a terrible tragedy, it certainly goes a long way to demonstrate very visibly to those parts of the population tempted by populist temptation that governments around Europe, they're not only, and that was a little bit the suspicion, good at administering the status quo, they're good at responding quite forcefully to new challenges as they present themselves. So governments, together with parliaments, the democratically elected representatives of the citizens, they're quite capable of acting. There's no inherent status quo bias that is so strong that one needs to have a desire for populist disruption, which I think sometimes was the reason for the rise of populism in parts of Europe, in addition to the many other social factors, economic factors, sometimes cultural factors that were at play. When it comes to Germany and our response to the crisis, there's of course the health side of things, and there we were fortunate that our health system had what was previously often thought as a bit of an overcapacity, and it turned out that this overcapacity served us reasonably well in this crisis. This was a lucky surprise, and certainly calls into question some of the ideas that people had about the rationalization of the health sector. But that's not the main subject I'm going to be talking about. I'll mainly talk about the economic response. What we managed, I think, to pull together is something that has very much a supply side to things, because of course the crisis in economic terms was a supply disruption, because of course many activities, they had to be shut down to stop the spreading of the disease. So there's a supply angle to this. And then of course there's a demand angle to this. There's uncertainty, people get scared about their present, about their future. And so there's a demand side to the problem, which I think we managed to address to some extent as well. And finally, there are all these big challenges that rightly progressive need to worry about. Probably first and foremost, the problem of climate change and how to organize energy transition in a way that is socially just at the same time. There's the digital disruption and how to deal with that. And there's, of course, the social side of all that transformation that's going on. So a huge responsibility for governments to organize that transformation and to invest in that transformation, including infrastructure, of course, education. And often in the past, we had political discussions where it was either only supply side or only demand side. And it was possible in the German government to push aside these old battles and these old frontiers and say, well, we need to do both, clearly. And we were able to push aside this old idea, either you do things that are good for the environment, or you do things that are good for the economy. And that was a little bit, there was a danger of us having that discussion in our car sector, but I think we also overcame that obstacle. So we have three very robust pillars, helping companies, protecting jobs, protecting, having short-time work. That's the sort of supply side pillar, then which has a demand side angle to it, because it of course protects wages. Then we have clear demand side elements, I think also socially quite well balanced. We have a extra child benefit of a couple of €100 per capita. But unfortunately, people like me, we have 4 children, but above a certain salary, that's clawed back at the end of the year. So it's only for middle and below average income families that this child benefit actually is paid out, which has a good, I think, also consumption implication. Then we have a temporary reduction in VAT. We have a reduction in the electricity levy, which was initially meant to fund clean energy, our energy transition, but turned out to be, in the end, a regressive tax on electricity. And increasingly, of course, clean electricity at that, so there was no good ecological reason to have it as expensive, so we have a reduction in that levy. And those are, to some extent, demand-side elements. There are others, but I won't bore you with a list of 57 measures that were agreed in the coalition. And finally, and that's a little bit linked also to the reduction in the electricity levy, we have a €50 billion package as part of our stimulus package that invests in new technologies, invests in energy transition, and also gives incentives to buy cleaner, for example, cleaner cars, cleaner buses, and so on. So it's not only research, but also creating market for these things, creating the infrastructure, including charging infrastructure, helping German rail become a better company, and so on. So these forward-looking, transformative elements to do with energy transition and digitalization that a good third of the package is dedicated to. So we're quite happy with that. In the greater scheme of things, to now move to the European discussion, and I know my time is starting to run out, and for some reason, Zoe, I can't see you any longer. I hope you can still hear me. Of course, Germany doing a lot will help other countries. We no longer have national economies. We have a single market. We have European economies. So there will be positive spillover. If Germany delivers a stimulus package, other countries in the single market will benefit substantially. If we help companies operating as European companies throughout the single market, not only will we protect jobs in Germany, we will by default also protect jobs in other parts of Europe. And that's a good thing, but obviously that's not enough. And that's why I was delighted when the French and the German government were able to agree on a proposal. And now there's a commission proposal out there, and still there's some countries still hesitant about the overall package, but the idea was to have a very sizable 500 billion euros recovery fund that would help citizens throughout Europe to sort of get back on track, geared in particular, and I think that's important. It's not the logic of DG Regio, where everybody really pays in and everybody gets out, and the net effect is rather small. But to have sizable grants to those regions, those countries who need the support the most in the COVID-19 crisis. And I think that sent a very powerful signal. Even just making this proposal, I hope now it will be put into practice shortly, and it's a great responsibility, of course, because hopefully it will be able to happen during the German presidency. Important signal to citizens throughout Europe that Europe is not the problem. Europe is part of the solution, and a powerful signal also to markets who might have become jittery, especially in countries who went into the crisis with a difficult fiscal position, that when push comes to shove, the EU is a community of fate sticking together. Behind that particular proposal, and my minister made that very clear, there's also the ambition to say, this is of course a one-off set of measures, but behind this is an ambitious project to create a more solid, more robust fiscal architecture for Europe. For the European Union, for the euro area, but that's of course a somewhat longer-term project. But it's still, I think, this ambition behind a very large one-off measure justifies my minister's talk about a Hamiltonian moment, and I think I'll leave it at that. I think already run out of time. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you, Jakob. And if I may just quickly come back on one point, because I know, as you say, it was quite to the pleasant surprise of many other European countries that Germany and France could agree on such a scale of package. Do you think this was something that would have come along later down the line in the face of another crisis? Was it to do with the scale of this crisis? Why did Germany change its position now?
Well, I mean, I think first of all, the scale of the crisis was very important, and one could not simply stand by and see other European countries experience such difficulties. And to be frank, I think there was a certain number of things that Germany did reasonably well in the crisis. Hopefully, part of it because it was well organized, but frankly, part of it was just pure luck. I mean, just imagine if we'd been sort of in the situation of Italy, having had the problems a little bit earlier, we wouldn't have been in a position to learn from the developments in other countries. And as it happened, we were. So a situation where you have a massive crisis and where clearly this wasn't about moral hazard. This wasn't about, you know, people getting it completely wrong. Even though, of course, it was possible to handle things a little bit better or a bit worse, but that's not the point. It was beyond our control. This pandemic is a natural catastrophe, and it's an obvious situation where one wants to stick together and survive this together if one is serious about the European Union as a political union. And so I think that made it much easier to convince people who'd been previously a little bit reluctant to go in that direction. And now was the time to overcome certain taboos and move forward. But it's one-off. I mean, I think it's also very important to say the measures as they're proposed, they're one-off proposals, but I think it will change the dynamic in which we will think about the future fiscal architecture of the euro, and that's the ambition that I just outlined.
Brilliant, thank you. That was really clear. And picking up the scale, Germany got lucky, not about moral hazard. I mean, that's rationalizes very clearly to me why Germany was so ready to step in at such scale. Thank you very much, Jakob. If we may now turn to Enna, who perhaps will share a bit the Swedish perspective on austerity or keeping away from it and public investment.
So, thank you. Thank you for the word, and thank you, Jakob, for the input. I wish that the Swedish social democratic government could be inspired by Merkel and the CDU and the position change they have made, because here in Sweden we are still a bit stuck in the past. And so my input will then start in the Swedish context, which I know the best, and later on I will land at the European level, where we have this strange situation that the Sweden's social democratically led red-green government has joined this frugal four, so-called, in opposing the Macron-Merkel recovery plan. And so in Sweden, the biggest obstacle right now for a progressive economic recovery after the corona crisis is actually this very frugal mentality of our Social Democratic Party, especially around the Ministry of Finance and our Finance Minister Magdalena Andersson. Because before the corona crisis, the Social Democrats here in Sweden have been strictly following Sweden's orthodox budget rules. And the focus has primarily been on paying off the public debt. At the end of 2019, the Swedish Maastricht debt level was lower than 35% of GDP. And the red-green government, they had a plan to reduce the debt to under 30% by 2022. And left-leaning parts of the Social Democratic Party and even blue-collar unions have for many, many years been critical of this very tight fiscal policy, which has made necessary public investment almost impossible in Sweden the last decades. And now, during the immediate corona crisis, during the spring, the government has continued, at least, with this frugal rhetoric, saying, for example, oh, there must be money left at the end of the year, when they are being criticized for not having big enough crisis packages to stimulate the economy. And we have even had a situation where our left-green government seems to be holding back and see a more limited role for the state in the crisis, while the liberal and conservative opposition seem to promote much more of state interventions to save the economy. Of course, their proposals from the right, they have the twist that they particularly want to save businesses, big businesses, and even shareholders' interests. So our biggest obstacle for a progressive economic recovery is if the Social Democrats here in Sweden refuse to abandon the frugal and very strict fiscal policy. And if this is unchallenged and unreformed, Sweden will have to once again return to another decade of austerity and big cuts in the public sector, just like we did after our economic crisis in the 1990s and after the last financial crisis. And I think that this logic should be unacceptable for any progressive political actor in Europe, not the least for the Swedish Social Democrats. And finally, some thoughts on the economic recovery on the European level. And with this background I have given you, maybe you now better understand why Sweden is among these frugal four in the EU, because we are also very frugal here in Sweden. And we are doing the best to try to change this. And I'm an active, actually, member of the Social Democrats in Sweden, and I sit in the board of a local social democratic economic policy organization. And our analysis is that Sweden should support a progressive recovery plan for Europe, but that we should learn from the mistakes made after the 2008 financial crisis. So we have identified four aspects that should condition the recovery fund and push it even more to a progressive side. And I will just read up the four aspects and end my input. So the first thing is that the Stability and Growth Pact should be revised to enable member states to focus on investment-led recovery instead of austerity. Two is that there should be a commitment not to impose the destructive demands for so-called structural reforms in the shape of privatizations and deregulations that followed the financial crisis last time. Three, an EU-wide tax on financial transactions should be implemented, and action should be taken to dismantle tax havens globally and of course within the European Union. And fourth, the last proposal is that the recovery package should be fully incorporated into the European Green Deal. So no support should be given to the fossil fuels industry, and investments should support an accelerated green transition in line with the Paris Agreement. So the most important thing here is that the recovery must have working people, ordinary people's interests at its core. And I will stop my input there, and I look forward for the discussion. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Enna. That's fantastic to hear about the Swedish and the frugal four, which I hadn't heard that. That's a good addition to the mix. If I may just come back just on one element, which is going back to what Ralph said right at the beginning about our progressive voters. So, you know, you talked about amending the Stability and Growth Pact to enable Sweden to invest more nationally, but if the government there and don't see that as the way forward, are they getting any pressure from voters to do so?
No, the discussion here is those who have been promoting this tight fiscal policy and saving money and paying off the debt. They are arguing now that this has served Sweden well, because now we have the fiscal muscles to do big packages and stimulus and so on. But the problem is that they are not really delivering this. They are continuing this with this fragility. And So there is the debate that will be big now is what we're going to do after the crisis. If we continue to have this position of having to push down the public debt, then I think they will have to return to austerity, which will be very problematic, because our argument is that actually we should have made investments in our healthcare, in our welfare, in our infrastructure, in the climate conversion that would have build up our societal muscles to tackle the crisis much better. Because the money we have piled up on a pile, they didn't help now when Sweden had the least critical care beds with respirators in Europe when Corona hit. So we had a under capacity in our healthcare system, and this has been a huge problem. So we should have spent the money before the crisis to build up these systems instead of just putting money on piles.
Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you very much. And now we'll turn to Silja, who perhaps will bring in the element of the welfare state and the role of the welfare state in rebuilding progressive societies.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Yes, I'm happy to do so, talk about the welfare state. And also I will try to go a bit into the politics of the welfare state, because I think in this context I expect to be quite large agreement on what the sensible policies might be going forward, but I think there are quite some challenges to overcome for progressive politics politically and electorally. So I would like to make an input on welfare state and welfare state politics based on a short piece that I wrote together with my colleague Jane Gingrich from the University of Oxford, and which will come out on the blog Social Europe. And in this short contribution, we take issue with a lot of articles and claims that have come out now towards the slide, in the COVID-19 crisis, and now with several countries kind of opening up again, and this discussion what the welfare policies of the next few years should be, whether we need to raise taxes and cut welfare in order to pay for the expenditures, which probably is not kind of the main position that we need to discuss here. But on the other hand, there were also more radical proposals saying that we need to completely rethink and reinvent the welfare state, and we cannot go back to the old way of doing social policy. We have to go more towards a universal basic income and completely reinvent what solidarity means, etc. And basically against these two polar positions, we argue that one of the most important lessons from the crisis this spring so far has been that the existing regular old welfare institutions, both in the labor market as well as in replacing and securing income, have proven to be very effective. And maybe where this is important is to see that there has increasingly been a debate, I think, over the past few years on whether social policy should be focused, or whether welfare states should focus on social investment on the one hand, so support employability, the functioning of the labor markets, etc., or whether welfare states should prioritize income protection and income replacement. And this discussion between social investment versus social compensation, if you want, I think the crisis has taught us that the two really are interdependent and are both relevant. And I think the crisis has shown that quite well, in the sense that we have seen that where labor markets and welfare institutions have been strongest and most stable, that countries have been best equipped to respond to the challenges. For instance, you see the importance of social investment and public investment in care infrastructure, in educational infrastructure, in good and well-skilled labor markets, in the fact that in different countries, the workforce has been very unequally able to kind of retreat at home to work. So the level of skill in the economies has made a huge difference in the extent to which workers could be sheltered from the risks. It also was important, of course, in terms of healthcare, but also elderly care and the quality of care provision in elderly care homes. So investment in public services was very important, but the social investment state or public investment in a well-skilled, well-functioning labor markets were also important in order to allow social compensation policies to be effective. I mean, we have talked a lot about the instrument of short-term work, which was kind of the key instrument in many countries in this crisis. But it was really instructive to see that this instrument was most effective where it had been in place for a long time and where the workforce was sufficiently well insured and well functioning for this instrument to actually reach the workers. So where you had dualized labor markets with a lot of temporary, part-time, atypical employment contracts, this instrument was not as effective as where you had well-skilled and well-insured labor markets, of course. So there is this interrelation between investment in labor markets and then social compensation. And where you could also see is that also the implementation of both the credits directly to firms, but also short-term work relied a lot on sufficient state capacity to even reach workers and also implement these policies quickly and effectively. So we think that we see that just as Enna said before, investment in public services and well-skilled labor markets kind of overcome the trade-off between economic recovery and solidarity. And I think that's a very important lesson for progressive politics, of course. But on the other hand, also, I mean, all these proposals for universal basic incomes, which basically rely on the idea of cutting the tie between the employment and social benefits on the other hand, it just appears how problematic this proposal is, because it really severes the link between a well-functioning labor market and welfare policies. Now, this all means that we don't have to reinvent the welfare state, which sounds like kind of a good news or a more moderate and feasible ambition, but I think that it's actually quite ambitious already for several reasons that I think are relevant for progressive political parties and forces. One is that I think this message that social investment and social compensation policies are interdependent, complement each other and need each other, is a message that resonates strongly with kind of a core social democratic mainstream left electorate. However, in the wider electorate, and of course social democrats with the kind of vote shares they have by now, they need allies in the political arenas. In other party electorates, the preferences of voters are much more distinctive, I would say. So for instance, kind of the typical middle-class new left electorate of Green parties, etc., they have a much stronger preference in favor of social investment, but are much more highly critical of social consumption. Whereas the opposite is true for kind of more conservative, workerist electorates. And building this coalition across different parties in favor of an encompassing and integrated approach is something that is not that is not going to be very easy, especially if electoral arenas continue to polarize between kind of new left middle class electorates and more workerist social policy agendas. So that is one concern I have, and then the second one, and I'll end my input with this. The second concern is that in the research we have been doing at the University of Zurich for the last few years, one finding that we have had already before Corona is that when people perceive the fiscal constraints to be tight, and when they perceive the fiscal leeway to be tight for governments to invest in welfare policies, solidarity, meaning supporting policies that are not to your own personal benefit, but to other people's benefit or to general social benefits, solidarity declines rather than increases. And especially people's preferences become much narrower. And we have seen that in previous crises, and you can also see that when you look at, when you give people different scenarios of how large fiscal leeway is, you can see quite quickly that their support really narrows on their on benefits that are more relevant for themselves, whereas solidarity with more vulnerable groups, also with immigrants, minorities, etc., tends to decline. So I think while I think coming out of the crisis for progressive politics, it's quite clear to know what the right policies are. It's really not obvious how majorities can be forged politically to implement them.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Silja. I think that's a really good challenge to, as you say, otherwise strong consensus between progressives on the way forward. And actually, perhaps just in the discussion, I'd like to pick up this question of work and whether jobs, work, skills actually should be the primary focus of EU countries. And I'd like to come back to you on that if I may. But last but not least, I would love László now to join us and to set out his vision for a progressive recovery, bringing in the European level.
Thank you very much, first of all, for inviting and giving me this opportunity to join this panel. I believe this is absolutely a critical debate about the recovery and its social dimension, not least because of the introduction in writing and also already referring to the previous failure of the European Union in the 2011 to 13 period, first of all, to avoid the recession, but secondly, also to really mitigate the social consequences of the recession, especially in crisis in countries that were assisted by the so-called Troika at that time in the reform programs. Now, I think even if we can still be critical about various elements, but there is a fundamentally different approach almost from the very start, and we need to appreciate that. There was a little bit of a trial and error, in the early phase of the crisis. But the fact that by May, the European Union managed to come forward with a new approach to the crisis response, and more precisely the recovery strategy, is something that has to be absolutely highlighted. If you look at it from the perspective of the European Union budget, which is the central tool for generating the recovery, this is a Copernican revolution. Why is it? It is because somehow suddenly a consensus emerged that the European Union budget can borrow. And previously this was an anathema, right? It always had to be in a balance and all the rest of it. And the second one is that it was also allowed suddenly that the European Union budget can play a stabilization role, which previously was always left to the national budgets, because the European Union budget was only seen in an allocation function and a modest degree of redistribution as well. The stabilization function means that debts that will be now allowed would only be repaid by 2058. So a very long-term perspective is being created. That's why they speak about the next generation. So in a way, introducing this very serious stabilization capacity means that we are turning the EU budget from its head to its feet, to use this expression borrowed from German philosophy. And the third one is breaking the glass ceiling. I mean, there was this mantra for a very long time that the EU budget is about 1% of the EU GNI. And even after Brexit, there was this poisonous language dominating the budget debate, that a smaller EU requires smaller budget, blah, blah, blah. And now suddenly the glass ceiling is broken because everybody realized that, going forward with the same size of the budget is going to be impossible. Of course, to arrive to this Copernican revolution required somehow the failure of the Eurogroup. And I think most of us knew that the Eurogroup is not a problem-solving body. But now they were exposed with the complete paralysis of not even decisions, but generating ideas for solving this crisis. There are many outstanding issues about the quality of the future spending from the fund which is going to be created, and the ways and the modes and the channels of spending. So there's a lot of details that need to be worked out, and the devil is going to be in these details. And in a way, what backfires now is that in the previous years, even a modest growth of the EU budget was prevented. In 2013, when the current budget, which is expiring in 2020, when this current budget was created and Germany was still part of the Frugal Four, the Commission proposed a modest increase, and the Frugal Four, which was Germany, Netherlands, the UK, and the Swedes, insisted on a reduction, which I think was absolutely wrong, because the budget should have been allowed to evolve, because that also means learning practices. So, money can not only be spent. Those who implement a budget need to learn how to implement it well. And in a way that was blocked when it should not have been blocked, just like the FTT. It's not a new idea. In the previous budget also, the FTT was proposed. Unfortunately, the UK and Sweden were very adamant to block it. But I also believe what other speakers highlighted, that this new type of budget alone is not going to solve the problem for a long term, right? So you can start stabilizing with a counter-cyclical budget, but it's also true that a more complete revision of the Stability and Growth Pact is going to be necessary. In fact, that was already launched. So the Commissioner Gentiloni at the beginning of this year already launched a review process, but somehow the importance of this diminished. But it will have to come back in order to ensure that at a later stage, there will be no return to counterproductive policies. Now, in a way, I was elaborating on this budgetary question because this is indeed a critical point, also to ensure that from a social point of view, the crisis is not going to be too devastating. But it's also important to see that what is developed and put forward and implemented in the domain of social policy at EU level is going to be crucial. A lot of people mistakenly think about social policy as a matter of subsidiarity alone. There's a large element of subsidiarity. On the other hand, there are now critical proposals on the table in Brussels, which will have to be developed in the coming period to avoid a backsliding to a time when there was a complete separation between how the monetary union functions and what social policy can do in the European Union level. For example, unemployment reinsurance has been promised. Gentiloni as well as Nicola Schmidt have been working on this when the pandemic came in March, the Commission suddenly put forward an instrument to finance Kurzarbeit at the European level, the so-called SURE instrument, but this is practically a kind of second best instrument because the scope of the SURE can only be more limited than an unemployment reinsurance fund. So that certainly should not be taken out of the agenda, even if it comes with a little delay. Minimum wage coordination. There is a second stage of a consultation on minimum wages, but that also is going to be vital. So it was already a recognition at the time of the previous crisis that somehow wage policies would also need to be coordinated, even if it's a matter of the social dialogue. But that needs to be also promoted by the EU. So this is also on the table, waiting for a formal proposal later this year. And then additions to welfare state capacity in the member states, a child guarantee proposal, for example, or some way to set minimum standards in healthcare, or promoting gender equality, partly by pay transparency, but also potentially by other means, is going to be very important on the agenda. The last point from me perhaps is that, yes, there is a lot of diversity in Europe. We already saw that in economic policy, for example, between Germany and Sweden, there is a different approach. And there are very good models, especially in my view, from the progressive governments, like in Denmark, like in Spain, where the approach is to strengthen social dialogue further, to use the consociational elements of the democracy to develop a crisis response which leads to better outcomes. On the other hand, there are also the authoritarian governments, like in Hungary, for example, which use this situation for a power grab and a wealth grab. And then they leave a lot of people on the roadside to suffer from unemployment and deprivation. And there are very interesting phenomena among the populist governments like the UK, which, you know, in a very counterintuitive way, came forward with a very serious wage subsidy policy. And when there is public resistance or public campaign, they are backtracking on the issues like yesterday on the school meal, financing the meal of children in the summer period. So public pressure is very important because through that, not only the progressive, but sometimes other types of governments can also be forced to do the right thing. Thank you.
Thank you, László. That was brilliant. And like you say, admittedly from the UK, we have seen a Conservative government providing one of the most generous furlough schemes, essentially paying 80% of people's wages whilst this crisis has been going forward, which has somewhat reset the debate in the UK in a sense, because it shifted what the spectrum of options are between the two political parties. And yes, as you say, László, just yesterday, the British government U-turned on a decision to fund free school meals for school children over the summer from more deprived families, and with no little thanks to a rather famous footballer who made the case based on his own personal experience. So, as you say, there can be responses to responsive government too, can sometimes work in our favour. László, I just wanted to pick up on one of your earlier points around the new discussion about fiscal solidarity in the EU. Do you think the EU is ready? Do you think, like Jakob was saying earlier, this is a one-off attempt at fiscal solidarity, or is this the beginning of a new renewed discussion about fiscal risk sharing?
Well, in my view, the European Union is going to enter a new stage, and then the rule of most crisis responses is that a lot of tools which you consider temporary are going to stay at the end for a variety of reasons. In the previous crisis, for example, when the idea for the ESM, the European Stability Mechanism, was first introduced, the language was that, this is a temporary mechanism, and when the crisis is over, it can be abolished. No, it has to be permanent, right? Because the Maastricht model of the monetary union was born, in a very incomplete way. And it's not an aesthetic question, whether it's incomplete or not. Like, Aphrodite of the Milo is incomplete, but it's nice as it is. The monetary union is not, right? It has to be completed. And it needs to be given the resilience. And without these new tools, burden sharing, risk sharing, it's not going to be sustainable.
Thank you. That's a very clear response. Enna, I think you just wanted to come in there.
No, I was very interested in what Silja said at the end of her input about research showing that when people perceive the fiscal policies being tight and that there is not money enough, then their solidarity narrows. And I think this is a great task for progressive forces to actually, after decades and decades of austerity and this kind of frugal rhetoric, to convince people even that we can afford the future, we can afford investments, we can afford a transition, there is money. So you after this mentality, because we have had so long austerity, I think it is really important to come out with this message. So therefore it is problematic, for example, that our social democratic ministers continue to spread the image of that there is not enough money, we have to have a tight fiscal policy and so on. So I think that's a thing to bring from this discussion is actually we also have to convince people that this is not dangerous, this is good, and we can actually afford this. And so the first step is convincing that an expensive fiscal policy is needed. We need to spend more, and that it is not dangerous to borrow for necessary investments. It's not dangerous. But the question between progressive and right policies comes at the next step, when everybody accepts that, we should spend more, we should stimulate, we can borrow. The question is what to spend the money at. And here comes like the differentiation between the left and the right. Should we spend it on bailing out businesses, shareholders, banks? Should we spend it at cutting taxes? Or should we spend it on social policy, on the welfare state, healthcare, elderly care, but also housing, building infrastructure, and the climate transition? So the kind of traditional economic competition, right-left competition, emerges in the discussion of how to spend now this money that we actually have and can afford.
Yeah, I like your two-step approach. Jakob, I think you wanted to come on then.
I really liked what Enna just said, and I want to bring a little bit together with Silja's remarks earlier on about different parts of the progressive spectrum. And I think one of the traps that a part of the progressive spectrum had fallen into was to say, well, we need to achieve climate neutrality. We need to achieve energy transition. And the only reason to do that is to move into a kind of degrowth mode, where growth is a problem. Now, if you do that, and if you believe, I happen not to believe that, but if you believe degrowth is the only possible answer to our environmental challenge, then of course, a kind of progressive austerity mindset follows. Because the reason why we don't need to worry so much about debt is precisely because, you know, there's growth. And it's not a numerator, it's a denominator effect that keeps debt to GDP ratio under control. But if your assumption is basically zero growth or shrinkage, then you have to balance the budget all the time. Otherwise, there's a horrible problem. And so I think only if we manage, and I think we're starting to manage, but we're not quite there yet, to reconcile economic growth with environmental protection and sustainability, can we go down the route that Enna finds reasonable, that I find reasonable, László, I'm sure also, and Silja. But I think that's a very critical point, and I think it bears emphasizing that unless we manage to reconcile sustainability and growth, we will fall into a progressive austerity trap. It's a mathematical inevitability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe if I can come in here,
Yeah,
I wholeheartedly support what Enna and Jakob just said, of course. Just to emphasize one thing, Enna said, you know, when fiscal constraints are tight, or when the perception of the fiscal leeway is very narrow, then you know, you said once we can spend, then the differences between the left and the right come up on what actually we spend on. But I think just like Jakob just emphasized, what is really the challenge for the progressive political forces is that these differences exist even within the progressive bloc. And Jakob has mentioned some of them. Have the degrowth versus pro-growth camps, even though I think that kind of the really degrowth camp is quite minoritarian still. But even within the progressive forces who are in favor of strong welfare state and expanding welfare states, there are really different sensitivities and priorities. If you asked, and this is based on public opinion data across 8 European, West European countries, from the Nordic countries to Southern Europe, if you ask kind of the typical middle-class green voter what to spend money on in terms of welfare policies, you will get the answer education, to some extent health, then work, care, reconciliation policies, but everything kind of investment-based and skill-based, etc. If you ask the typical manual worker or lower-skilled working class left voter, he or she will say pensions and then some unemployment insurance. And these are very diametrically opposed views on what is most urgent and most important. So I really think that for kind of a progressive agenda to be effective electorally and also successful politically, releasing the fiscal constraint, so to speak, is really a precondition and extremely important. So the fiscal side of it is kind of a precondition for the distributive side to be politically effective.
And actually, Silja, if I may come back to you, you know, you picked up on the differences within the progressive movement, and I know some of your work has been particularly on the lower income end of the spectrum. We've certainly seen in the UK that precarious work, who tend to be those on the lower end of this income spectrum, has come back into sharp focus, and the debate is now very much centred on jobs and job contracts and stability. Is this something we could unite around? What does your work show?
Well, you know, I think there was, when the discourse around social investment came up, about social investment as a concept, kind of releasing this trade-off between economic prosperity and social justice, and saying, if we do this, then we get both at the same time, and kind of the magic bullet. There was a hope associated with it that it could be kind of this unifying project where everyone can agree on. And I think, you know, that on the basic principles of having good jobs, I think that is kind of a unifying discourse that a lot of people can agree on. But then when it's about the concrete policy instruments that you need in order to get there, I found more divisions than I expected. So on average, lower skilled, lower income, left-wing voters do not prioritize kind of human capital formation. Their priority is social protection, is income replacement, with good reasons, right? There are very understandable reasons for why you prioritize like this, but it's I think this idea of investing in skills and training and education as a policy that would just unite the entire progressive spectrum, that's not what we see. I mean, social investment is very much a middle-class policy supported by middle-class voters. And I think so if we think electorally, then the balance between social protection on the one hand and social investment on the other hand is key for a progressive agenda.
Are there any other concluding points that any of the panelists would like to make in our final few minutes together? Jakob.
I want to come back to László's remark on what the current set of measures, and I think he rightly stressed the unemployment reinsurance instrument mean. They're clearly, I mean, legally, the legal basis is that they're a one-off temporary thing. But they're, I think, going to dramatically change the terms of the debate. And I think they will allow us, very much in the spirit of this session, to move forward for a solid fiscal architecture for the euro area that brings together, and these are not empty words, but I think they're very important, solidarity and responsibility. So it's really making sure that there's the necessary degree of European solidarity, and that's politically a difficult process, but at the same time making sure this also means we move more responsibility, including democratic governance responsibility, to the European level, because what doesn't work is to move solidarity to the European level and then still have everybody decide nationally. Then you end up with a massive common pool problem. And what also doesn't work is to move a lot of responsibility and power to the European level, but have no solidarity. It would be a recipe for disaster. And so I really liked what László was saying, and I think it's a nice way to sum up a certain number of elements that were raised during the session.
Thank you. László.
Yeah, maybe to be even more synthetic, I think the additional point is that the safety nets have to be there ex ante. So when the crisis is already there, to come with various ideas that, oh, you know, how nice it is if we prevent big problems. Look, speed matters a lot. And then when the crisis is already there, you know, practically everything is too late if you didn't think about it. And it's, of course, a little bit frustrating that most of these ideas about unemployment insurance and youth guarantee and child guarantee were developed in the previous years. And probably there was this kind of complacency after the Eurozone crisis that if we are prudent, if we reinforce, you know, financial supervision, there will never be another crisis like 2009. And now for a different reason, there is one. You know, the safety nets need to be developed. And once the labor market was also mentioned, I think it's also very important that if there is a possibility for labor market reform, now the direction should be to ensure that those who are part-timers, those who are self-employed or bogus self-employed or work in the gig economy, platform workers, they are also brought back to social security. Because there will be an increasing share of these workers in the future, but they should only increase as long as they remain inside social security. Because again, in case of any kind of economic downturn, they are going to be the most vulnerable.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Well, thank you to all five of you, Enna, Silja, László, and Jakob, and for Ralph for his opening comments. This afternoon has been an incredibly, I think, optimistic, forward-looking discussion about using this moment of strife and difficulty to come together, recognise actually that we do have growing amounts of solidarity within both Europe and with our neighbours who we need to help make the case at their level. I'm looking to you, Enna, in Sweden, for helping put the case for greater investment at this moment. I loved Jakob's phrase of progressive austerity and how we must move away from that to ensure that, you know, we're investing to grow so that our debt doesn't become a problematic or be seen to be problematic in the future. I'm feeling optimistic. I hope you all are. It's been an excellent discussion. Many thanks to you and to our viewers this afternoon. Thank you.